My husband died on a Tuesday in November. The funeral was that Friday. My parents called on Thursday evening, the night before we buried him. And my mother said, "We need to talk about the weekend." I thought she was calling about the reception, about the food, about whether there was something she could bring. Instead, she said, "Renee's birthday dinner is Saturday. We already have the reservation. 22 people are coming, most of them from out of town, and we can't cancel at this point." I sat in the bedroom that still smelled like Marcus, his side of the bed, his jacket on the chair, his half-finished book on the nightstand, and I held the phone and said nothing for long enough that my mother said, "Sloan, are you there?" I said, "I'm here." She said, "You understand, don't you? Renee has been planning this for months." I said, "My husband's funeral is tomorrow, Mom." She said, "We'll be there tomorrow. We're talking about Saturday." I did not say what I was thinking. I had a 7-year-old daughter in the next room who had cried herself to sleep 3 nights in a row and who was going to wake up in the morning and put on a black dress and bury her father. And I did not have the capacity to also have this conversation. I said, "Okay." I hung up. 3 years later, at a dinner table in my sister's house, my daughter Violet looked at my parents across the breadbasket and said one sentence that none of us had prepared for. And the silence that followed lasted longer than anything any adult in that room could have managed. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're watching from. My name is Sloan Aldridge. I'm 38 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, with my daughter Violet, a 10-year-old who reads too fast for the library to keep up with her, and a rescue dog named Porter who sleeps at the foot of her bed, and has, in the 3 years since we lost Marcus, become the steadiest presence in our house besides her. This is the story of what grief actually looks like when the people who are supposed to hold you are busy somewhere else, and what happens when a child says the thing that every adult in the room has been too careful to say. Let me take you back to Wilmington, North Carolina. The house on Oleander Drive where I grew up, 3 bedrooms, a screened porch, a yard with a fig tree my father planted the year I was born, and still talked about the way some men talk about athletic achievements. My father, Raymond Goodwin, was a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company. Reliable income, company car, a business travel schedule that meant he was home 4 days out of 7 if the week was good, and 3 if it wasn't. He was not a distant father. He was a managed one. His attention was organized around a hierarchy I understood from a young age. And the hierarchy had a logic to it, even if the logic didn't always include me. My mother, Carol, taught 3rd grade for 18 years before moving into curriculum development for the school district. She was the kind of woman who remembered every child in every class she'd ever taught, but sometimes had to pause before she recalled the details of her own daughter's school years. This is not a criticism dressed as an observation. It is an observation. She gave genuinely to the world. She just gave to it in a direction that sometimes missed the people closest to her. My sister Renee was 3 years older, the kind of older sister who occupied the family's emotional real estate so completely that there was never quite enough left for anyone else. Not through malice, through sheer volume. Renee had needs the way weather has needs, continuously, loudly, and with the confidence that the surrounding environment would reorganize around them. She had her first breakdown at 22, and her second at 26, and her third at 31. And each breakdown received the family's full and immediate mobilization. I learned, watching those mobilizations, that crisis was the currency that bought attention in our household, and I was not someone who manufactured crisis. I was someone who managed quietly and therefore received quietly. I met Marcus Aldridge at a graduate school orientation in Chapel Hill when I was 24. He was studying urban planning. I was studying public health administration. We sat next to each other at a table for two in a coffee shop where every other seat was taken, and we talked for 3 hours about cities and systems and the specific problem of building things meant to last in a world that keeps changing. He had the kind of mind that went to the root of things rather than the surface, and the kind of patience that let you take your time getting there. I have never, before or since, felt so quickly understood. We married when I was 27. Small wedding, 60 people, a garden ceremony at a venue outside Chapel Hill that cost us $4,200 and felt like exactly what it was: two people who had decided to build a life together and didn't need an audience to confirm it. My parents were there, warm and present. My sister Renee was maid of honor and gave a toast that was, in the specific tradition of Renee's toasts, primarily about Renee's feelings about the occasion. Marcus leaned over to me during it and whispered, "This is going very well for her." I laughed into my champagne. That was Marcus, the quiet observation that said everything without requiring a scene. Violet was born when I was 30, 8 pounds, 2 ounces, born on a Thursday afternoon in September, emergency C-section after 14 hours of labor that had stopped progressing. Marcus held her before I could, because I was still in recovery, and he stood at the window of the hospital room with her and talked to her. I could see his mouth moving but not hear the words for a long time before the nurse asked him to let the pediatrician in. I asked him later what he had said. He said, "I told her what she'd gotten herself into with us. I figured she should know up front." I asked what he told her. He said, "I said, your mother is the most competent person I have ever met, and you're going to spend your whole life trying to catch up to her, and it will be the best thing that ever happened to you." I didn't say anything. Some things don't require a response. They just require witnessing. Marcus was diagnosed at 33, pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, found in August when he went in for what we thought was a persistent digestive issue, and came out with a different understanding of everything. He was 41 months of treatment before he died in November, 4 years later. 41 months of chemo and clinical trials, and the specific arithmetic of good weeks and bad ones of watching him work on a Thursday and sleep through a Saturday, of Violet doing her homework at the kitchen table and Marcus helping from the couch, propped on pillows. His voice still the same voice even when the body around it was changing. I am not going to tell you the full 41 months, because the 41 months belong to us and to Violet and to Marcus's family, and to the people who showed up at 2 in the morning with soup and clean sheets and no expectation of conversation. What I will tell you is what it looked like from the family side. My family, the Goodwins, because it is relevant to the Thursday phone call, and what came after. My parents came to the diagnosis appointment. They were there, present, scared in the genuine way of people confronting a reality they hadn't prepared for. My mother held my hand in the waiting room. My father asked the oncologist 3 pages worth of questions that showed he had done research on the drive down, which is exactly the kind of thing my father did when he needed to feel useful. I was grateful for all of it. They came to the first 3 chemo sessions. They offered to stay with Violet so Marcus and I could have time together during his better weeks. They sent food in the early months, my mother's pot roast, my father's specific obsession with finding the exact right chicken soup recipe from a food blog he'd been experimenting with. There was real love there. I want to say that clearly and first, because what comes next makes more sense against the background of genuine love than it does as the story of people who simply didn't care. What happened over 41 months was something more complicated than not caring. What happened was that my parents' capacity for sustained crisis engagement ran out. Not suddenly, gradually, the way a well runs down in a long drought. By month 18, they were coming less frequently. By month 26, the calls were shorter. By month 30, my mother had resumed the full schedule of her social life, and my father had taken a golf trip, and both of these things were fine. Marcus specifically told me they were fine, that people needed to live their lives, that he didn't want to be the thing that froze everyone around him in place. But fine for Marcus was different from fine for me, and fine for me was different from what our household actually needed. And the distinction between those three things was never fully navigated out loud. By month 38, I had stopped calling my parents when things got hard. Not because I was protecting them, because I had done the math on what I would receive in return, and it didn't cover the cost of asking. I had my friend Delia Marsh, who had been my college roommate and who showed up so consistently and so completely that she became the person Violet called Aunt Delia without anyone suggesting it. I had Marcus's sister Fern, who lived 40 minutes away and who understood grief in the pre-grieving sense because she was losing her brother in real time and understood what that required. I had a therapist named Dr. Rachel Owens who had been seeing me since month 12 and who was the reason I was still functional at month 38. My parents had Renee, who had a crisis that fall. Not a psychiatric one this time, a professional one, a falling out with a business partner that required several extended phone calls and 2 visits, and the full mobilization of the Goodwin family support apparatus. I know this because my mother mentioned it on a call in September, the same call where she mentioned, at the end, that Marcus didn't look well in the photos I'd posted. He didn't look well because he was dying. He died 6 weeks later. He died on a Tuesday at 6:14 in the morning. Violet was asleep. I was sitting beside him holding his hand the way I had been sitting for 3 days, and at some point the breathing that had been irregular became still, and the still became permanent, and I sat there for a long time before I got up and went to Violet's room and sat on the edge of her bed and told her, "I am not going to tell you that part either. Some things are only ours." The funeral was Friday. My parents came Thursday, late afternoon, and stayed at a hotel 8 minutes from our house. My mother cried when she arrived. My father hugged me for longer than he had hugged me in years. They were present in the way of people who are present for the event while the event is happening, and who do not fully understand that the event does not end when the reception does. Thursday evening, my mother called about Saturday. Renee's birthday dinner. 22 people. Reservation already made. Can't cancel. I said okay. I hung up. Delia was at my house when I came back into the kitchen. She had been there since Tuesday. She had not asked if she should come. She had arrived. She looked at my face when I came back in and said, "What?" I told her. She set down the dish she was drying. She said, "Sloan." I said, "It's fine." She said, "It's not fine." I said, "I know, but I can't do anything about it tonight." She said, "Okay." She picked the dish back up. She did not say anything else about it because she understood with the specific intelligence of someone who has known you for 15 years when the time for language has passed. My parents were at the funeral Friday. They stood with me and with Marcus's family, and they were present in every visible way. My father read a passage Marcus had chosen from a book about cities and time and the things people build that outlast them, and he read it well and meant it. My mother held Violet's hand during the graveside service, and Violet led her, which told me something about Violet's specific and profound generosity toward people who hadn't fully earned it yet. Saturday morning they went to Renee's birthday dinner. I want to tell you exactly what Saturday morning looked like in our house, because the specificity matters. I woke at 5:47 a.m. because I had been waking at 5:47 a.m. every morning for 4 days, and the body does not care about context. Marcus's side of the bed was still his side. I had not moved anything. I did not intend to move anything for a long time. Violet came into the bedroom at 6:30 and got into bed on my side, and we lay there in the gray November light, and I read to her from the book she'd been reading with Marcus, a novel about a girl who discovers she can talk to trees, which was exactly the kind of book Marcus would have found and given her. And we stayed like that until Porter started scratching at the door, and Violet laughed, and the laugh was the most important sound I had heard in a week. Delia made breakfast. She was still there, would stay through Sunday, would come back the following Friday, and the Friday after that. She made eggs and toast and coffee, and the specific kind of practical quiet that means, I am not going anywhere, and I am not asking you to perform anything. My parents called at 9 to say they were checking out of the hotel and heading to Renee's dinner venue to help set up. My mother said, "We'll call you tonight. Are you going to be okay today?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Delia's there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay, sweetheart. We love you." I said, "I know." I hung up. Violet was at the kitchen table eating toast. She had heard the call. She looked at me with the expression she had inherited directly from Marcus, the one that went to the root of things before the surface, and said, "Are they going to Aunt Renee's birthday?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Because they can't cancel?" I said, "Something like that." She said, "Oh." She ate her toast. She did not say anything else. She did not say anything else for 3 years. Let me tell you about the 3 years, because they are not 3 years of simmering resentment. They are 3 years of a life being rebuilt from the only materials available, which is always the only way a life gets rebuilt. Violet, and I stayed in the Raleigh house. I went back to work in January, 3 months after the funeral, in my position as a public health program manager at a nonprofit that worked on maternal health initiatives in underserved counties. Marcus had been a planner. He had planned for this. The life insurance, the retirement accounts structured for transfer, the specific and methodical preparation of a man who had 41 months to think about what he was leaving and made every one of them count. We were not financially broken. We were just broken. I went to Dr. Owens twice a week for the first year. Once a week after that. She was the one who said, in February of the first year, "You have been managing your family's experience of this loss since November. When are you going to let yourself have your own experience?" I said, "I don't know what that means." She said, "I think you do." I did. I just hadn't had anyone say it out loud before. Violet saw a grief counselor named Ms. Patricia Webb at her school. Patricia called me in March and said, "I want you to know your daughter is one of the most emotionally articulate children I have ever worked with. She is processing this in a way that would be remarkable in an adult." She said, "She also never talks about your parents." I said, "What does she say when they come up?" Patricia said, "She changes the subject, precisely and quickly, like someone who has decided a door doesn't open." I noted this. My parents came to Raleigh 4 times in the first year. Each visit was warm, well-intentioned, and slightly off-center in the specific way of people who are relating to a version of you they built before the thing happened, and have not yet updated. My mother talked about Renee frequently, not in the comparative way she had when I was younger, but as a subject, a default, the thing that filled the silence. My father asked about work and about Violet's school and seemed relieved when I answered well and didn't require him to navigate anything harder. They were doing their best. Their best was calibrated to a grief that had a shape they recognized, the acute, visible, time-limited kind. And I was living a grief that was daily and permanent and did not resolve into something manageable on any timeline they could understand. Delia came every month. Fern came every other week. Dr. Owens was there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Porter was there every night. Violet was there, growing, reading, asking questions Marcus would have loved, saying things that made me laugh in the specific way that is also crying, the full overlap laugh cry of a person who is both devastated and genuinely grateful at the same time. In the second year, I started a community grief support group at the nonprofit. not because it was part of my job description, but because I had looked around the room of people I worked with and understood that unacknowledged grief was the water everyone was swimming in and nobody was naming it. 15 people attended the first session. 31 attended the sixth. I tell you this not to narrate my own recovery, but because it is relevant to who I was by the time we got to Renee's house on that Saturday 3 years later. I was not the same person who had said okay on the phone the night before Marcus's funeral. I had done 3 years of the specific and unglamorous work of finding out who I was in the absence of the person I had organized my life around. I knew what I thought. I knew what I was willing to say. I was no longer performing okay for the benefit of people who needed me to be okay. The dinner at Renee's house was her idea. An olive branch, she said, a real family dinner. Renee had a 5-bedroom house in Cary with a formal dining room she used twice a year and a kitchen she had renovated in the second year of my grief and shown me photographs of on a phone call, during which she had not asked how I was doing. The invitation was for the first Saturday in November, exactly 3 years after Marcus died, which Renee had either not tracked or not mentioned, and I had not pointed out. Delia, who knew about the date, said, "You don't have to go." I said, "I know." I went anyway, because Violet wanted to see her grandparents, and because I had decided at some point in the previous 18 months that I was no longer going to make my life smaller to avoid the rooms where difficult things might happen. My parents were already there when we arrived. My father hugged me at the door. My mother hugged Violet for a long time. Renee had cooked, which she did well when she applied herself, and the house smelled good, and the table was properly set, and there were flowers, which made me look at Violet to see if she noticed, and she did. She touched one of the stems briefly, a ranunculus, the way she touched things she was cataloging. It was a good gesture from Renee. I received it as such. We sat down, Renee and her husband Patrick, my parents, Violet and me, Renee's daughter Sophie, who was 9, and Violet's closest cousin. Grace was being extended on all sides. The bread was passed. The wine was poured. My father asked Violet about school, with the genuine curiosity he had been developing toward her over 3 years of visits that had gotten slowly, incrementally more real. Then my mother said, not cruelly, filling a pause, reaching for something warm and familiar, "We're so glad we could all be together. Doesn't it feel good to have the whole family in one place?" She was looking at the table generally, at the food and the people, the kind of statement that is more atmosphere than content. She said, "We should do this more often. We should really make the time." Violet looked up from her plate. She looked at my mother for a moment with the expression Marcus had left her, the one that went to the root before the surface. And she said, in a voice that was entirely calm, "You miss my dad's funeral weekend for this." The table went completely silent. Not the silence of a room waiting for the next thing. The silence of a room that has had the floor removed. Sophie looked at Violet. Renee looked at her plate. Patrick looked at the wall behind my head. My father set down his fork with a precision that was clearly intentional, setting it down the way you set something down when you need your hands free for what comes next. My mother looked at Violet for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I let her look at me. I did not rescue her from the sentence. I did not say Violet, and I did not say let's not, and I did not redirect. I had spent 3 years not saying the true thing in the rooms where the true thing needed to be said, and I had decided, sitting at a dining room table in Cary on the 3rd anniversary of the worst week of my life, that I was not going to do it again. I said nothing. I waited. My father said, "Violet." Violet looked at him. He said, "You're right." He said it clearly. He said, "What your grandmother said didn't come out the way she meant it. But what you said is true, and I want you to know that you were allowed to say it." He looked at me. "We made a mistake 3 years ago, and we haven't said so directly, and we should have. My mother had her hand over her mouth. Not performing, containing. The specific gesture of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has just had it named by a 10-year-old. She said, "Violet, I'm sorry." She said, "I should have been there that whole weekend. I should have told the restaurant to keep the reservation and sent your Aunt Renee a gift and stayed with you and your mother." She said, "I didn't do that, and I've thought about it a lot, and I want you to know that I was wrong." Violet looked at her grandmother for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Grandma." She said it simply, without performance, the way children say things when they mean them without needing them to be complicated. I just wanted someone to say it out loud. She picked up her fork and went back to dinner. Let me pause right here because I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it before you answer in the comments. If a child in your family said the true thing that every adult had been too careful to say, would you have let it stand, or would you have managed it, smoothed it, redirected it towards something easier? I have asked people this for months. The answers are the most revealing thing I have ever collected. Tell me what you would have done. Let me tell you what happened after that dinner. My father called me on Sunday morning. He said, "I want to talk about Thursday." I said, "Okay." He said, "The night before the funeral, your mother's call." I said, "Yes." He said, "I knew she was going to call. I knew what she was going to say, and I didn't tell her not to." He said, "I've been telling myself for 3 years that it was her call, her decision, and I stayed out of it." That's not true. I stayed out of it because saying something would have started a conversation I didn't have the energy for. He said, "That was a failure of character. Not hers alone, mine more, because I knew better, and I was quiet." He said, "I'm sorry, Sloan." He said it in the direct, unqualified way. My father said the few important things. He said, no preamble, no softening, no request for absolution at the end of it. Just the true sentence. "I'm sorry." I said, "Thank you for calling." He said, "That's not enough." I said, "I know, but it's the right place to start." He said, "What would help? Actually help?" I said, "Keep showing up. Don't make me perform okay to make you comfortable. When Violet says something true, let it stand." He said, "Okay." He said, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can." My mother called Sunday afternoon. Her voice had the specific quality of a woman who has spent 24 hours inside something she can no longer manage her way around. She said, "I have been thinking about Saturday night since the moment Violet said it." She said, "I have been thinking about the phone call for 3 years and telling myself it wasn't as bad as it was. And then a 10-year-old said 12 words, and I understood that it was exactly as bad as it was." She said, "I don't know how to fix 3 years." I said, "You can't fix 3 years. You can change what the next 3 look like." She said, "Tell me how." I said, "Be there, specifically and actually. When I call and say it's a hard week, I don't want a suggestion to call Delia. I want you to ask what the week looked like." She said, "Okay." I said, "When Violet says something true at a dinner table, I need you to let it be true instead of smoothing it over." She said, "I did Saturday. I let it be true." I said, "You did." I said, "That's the version of you I need." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I missed so much." She said, "Not just the weekend. The whole. I think I kept waiting for the acute part to be over so I could show up for the recovery. And then there was no recovery. It was all acute, and I kept waiting." I said, "Yes." I said, "That's exactly what happened." She said, "I'm sorry, Sloan." I said, "I know, Mom." Renee called Monday. Her call was harder to navigate because Renee's calls are always harder to navigate. She processes through layers of her own feeling before she gets to anyone else's, and the distance to travel is longer. She said, I've been thinking about the birthday dinner. 3 years ago. She said, I didn't ask them to come. I want you to know that. Mom just called me and said they were coming, and I assumed you were fine. I said, Renee, I wasn't fine. She said, I know. I understand that now. She said, I think I've spent our whole lives assuming you were fine because you never said you weren't. I said, because when I wasn't fine, the family's attention was usually occupied. A pause. She received that. I could hear her receiving it. She said, I know. She said, I haven't been easy to have as a sister. I said, You're my sister. Easy isn't the standard. She said, What is? I said, Present. She said, I'm going to try to be more present. I said, I know. I said, Renee, I need to tell you something. She said, Okay. I said, the dinner 3 years ago was your birthday. Marcus had been dead for 4 days. I said okay on the phone, and I want you to know that I have never blamed you for that birthday existing. The birthday wasn't the problem. The problem was the choice my parents made about what mattered more. She said, I know. She said, I've thought about it too. She said, I'm sorry you had to spend that Saturday without them. I said, Thank you. I said, That's the first time anyone from this family has said that. She said, I know. She said, It should have been said a long time ago. Let me tell you where everyone is now. Violet is 10. She reads 3 books a week. She has Marcus's mind and my stubbornness and a moral clarity that is entirely her own. It did not come from me or from Marcus. It came from the specific combination of us, and from 3 years of living inside a grief that required her to understand things most children don't have to understand until much later. She is the person in any room who notices the thing that isn't being said. I cannot explain how much I love her for it. My father comes to Raleigh once a month now. He calls on Sundays. He asks specific questions about my work. The grief support program has expanded to 4 counties, and we're in the process of applying for state funding. And my father has offered to review the financial projections because it turns out 30 years of running a business produces skills that transfer. He has not once in the last year waited for me to perform okay before asking what's actually happening. This is a change so specific and so sustained that I have stopped being surprised by it and started expecting it. Expecting it is better. My mother sends Violet a book every month. She started this after the dinner. Not a grand gesture announced as a grand gesture, just a package arriving with a note that says something like, I thought you'd like this one. Tell me what you think. Violet tells her, in detail, in the calls that happen now more regularly and more honestly than they happened before November 3 years ago. Last month, Violet called my mother to tell her about a scene in a book that made her think of Marcus, and my mother listened to the whole thing without redirecting it towards something easier. I know this because Violet told me after the call with some surprise, Grandma let me talk about Dad the whole time. I said, Did it help? She said, It felt like someone opened a window. Delia Marsh is still Aunt Delia. She always will be. Some relationships don't require the adjective earned. They just become true through use, the way certain paths become permanent from being walked. She was the person who stood in my kitchen on the Saturday that everyone else went somewhere else, and she was the person who made eggs and did not ask me to be fine. And she is, for that reason, and others, the person I trust most in the world after Violet, and before everyone else, Dr. Rachel Owens. And I meet once a month now. In the first session after the November dinner, she said, How did you feel when Violet said it? I said, Like she had opened a window. She said, The same word Violet used about your mother. I said, Yes. She said, What does that tell you? I said, That the truth is a window, that we've been living in rooms with the windows closed. She wrote something down. She said, How did it feel to not manage it? To let the sentence stand? I said. It felt like the first breath I'd taken in 3 years that I didn't have to measure. She said, "That's what honesty feels like when you've been careful for too long." She said, "Keep letting windows open." Marcus's sister Fern came for Thanksgiving. She brought her husband and their 2 boys and a sweet potato casserole Marcus had always requested, and we sat at the table with too many people and not enough chairs and borrowed a folding table from the neighbor, and it was loud and imperfect and completely right. Before we ate, Fern raised her glass and said, "To Marcus, who planned for everything except how much we'd miss him." Violet raised her juice glass. My father raised his wine. My mother reached across and held my hand. We said, "To Marcus." And then we ate. Here is what I want to say before I go. Grief does not ask permission. It does not check whether the moment is convenient. It does not wait for the birthday dinner to be over, for the reservation to be honored, for the 22 out-of-town guests to find a parking spot. It arrives on a Tuesday at 6:14 in the morning, and it is still there on Saturday. And it will be there next November, and the November after that. And what the people around you do in the Saturdays is the truest information you will ever have about who they are. My parents did not fail me because they didn't love me. They failed me because they had a habit built over decades of measuring the distance between themselves and my difficulty and making the calculation that it was manageable from where they were. They had done this my whole life with smaller things. Marcus's death was not a smaller thing. It was the largest thing. And the distance they maintained became visible in a way it had never been. And the visibility made it permanent in a way that a 10-year-old eventually named. Violet said 12 words at a dinner table. She was not performing. She was not trying to change anything. She was a child who had watched her mother carry a silence for 3 years and who had decided, in the specific, uncalculated way that children decide things when they have not yet learned to be careful, that the silence could be named. She named it. And the naming, not the argument, not the confrontation, not the 3 years of performed okay, was the thing that cracked the door. I did not manage it. I let it stand. That was the most important thing I did. If you have been carrying the weight of someone else's inability to show up, carrying it quietly, performing okay, saying the true thing only to yourself in the dark, I want you to hear this. The silence does not protect anyone. Not you, not them, not the relationship you're trying to preserve by being careful. The window cannot be opened from the outside. Someone on the inside has to reach for it. Sometimes that person is a 10-year-old with her father's eyes who says the thing you haven't been able to say in 3 years, in 12 words, over bread and ranunculus at a dinner table in Cary. Let her say it. Let it stand. The room will be quiet. The floor will shift. And then someone will put down their fork and say, "You're right." And that will be the first real breath anyone in the room has taken in a very long time. My name is Sloan Aldridge. I am 38 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, with my daughter who says true things and my dog who sleeps at the foot of her bed and a grief support group that now serves 4 counties and the particular kind of life that gets built not from what you planned, but from what you refused to abandon when the plan disappeared. My husband has been gone for 3 years. He is in the book Violet reads out loud to Porter on Sunday evenings. He is in the way she holds her fork. He is in the question she asks before she'll accept an answer. He is in the 12 words she said at a dinner table that no adult in the room had managed to say in 3 years. He always did give her the best of him. She is using it exactly right. Thank you for staying until the very end. If you have been performing okay for people who needed you to be okay before you were, drop a comment below. Tell me what you were carrying. I read every single one. If this story found you in a moment of a grief that isn't being seen, share it with the person who needs to know that the window can be opened. That someone is allowed to say the true thing. That letting it stand is the bravest choice in the room. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.